will do certain things. Follow her on Twitter and get to know what's going to happen tomorrow when it comes to security and geopolitics. So I'm going to let them do the talking. And Virendra, let me start with you. And let me ask you a broad question. Listen, we've been talking about SDGs, climate, gender, getting things right, getting people above poverty line. All of that is predicated on peace and security. Sitting today, knowing what has happened over the last 3 years and what is happening in recent weeks, China, Taiwan, Ukraine, Russia, the Himalayan conflicts of a couple of years ago, muscularity all over, bipolarity, multipolarity, everything, working at the same point at the same moment. How secure is the world today? What for you are the big questions we need to address? If we need to search for peace and security, what are we confronted with today?
Thank you for this wonderful question, and it really pains me that I have to be the one, spreading the bad messages, but that's my job. So sitting here, listening to these wonderful stories, listening to the inspiring speech by the minister, you see how actually many parts of the world operate differently. They have a different mindset. They don't want to get caught in these geopolitical struggles. They don't want to be caught by a binary world. They have to. They want to have different stories. They have also their own story that they want to push. But let's go back to the realities. And the reality is that the number of conflicts, the number of military conflicts, but also tensions in the world is unfortunately going to increase. We are actually at the threshold of a new, I think, big systemic conflict, a conflict between world systems, if you like. Once again, we are going to witness, unfortunately, a binarization, so bifurcation of the global order. That means the system splits into parts, being more or less operated by two systems of power, and the rest, so that means the big question mark, of course, is what is happening to the 6 billion of people getting caught in between. On the one side you have the West, on the other side you have China with its partners, but what happens with the rest? And the reality right now is that in this transitionary period of the international affairs, you have all these relevant players in between that oscillate. They try to navigate in this increasing, I call it disorder. So we are entering a period of disorder. You named the main issues. We have a system decoupling between the major powers, United States and China. We are going to witness increasing tensions between the two Asian giants, China and India, because India is en route to becoming a major economic power with all the ramifications for the global system. We are witnessing the decline of Europe as a relevant actor. Of course, on the one side, still a relevant geoeconomic actor, but with very limited geopolitical...
Let me interrupt you. I'm curious about the point you just made. There is a whole hula baloo in Europe that Eureka, we are now one, we are united, we have been in some sense forced to start thinking about security, start to behave like a political actor. You are actually arguing the opposite. Some would argue that this is the point that Europe might be rising as a political actor rather than declining.
In my world, in the world that I operate, and I argue that I've been rather correct than not correct with my estimations, you cannot be a relevant geopolitical actor without hard power. And the European Union, with the European powers, is still not this geopolitical actor, and I don't see a way how it's going to become one. So imposing sanctions, which was, the right thing to do following the invasion on February 24th, is not going to be efficient without international isolation. Russia, however, was not internationally isolated because in the meantime, Russia has already operated in other parts of the world and has forged alliances and partnerships with other regional partners. So the reality is that if the West does not, realize that the European security order has been actually torpedoed on February 24th, and there is still no sense of urgency, there is still no perception that this has happened, I argue that they will be, punched in the face by realpolitik once when they realize that international actors in Asia, in Latin America, in Africa are moving forward. And our problems, our European problems are not their problems.
I think that was well articulated by the Indian foreign minister,
Exactly.
that Europe needs to rethink of its own engagement with the world. But let me ask you, you raised another point. You mentioned that oscillate between these binaries, and you called it a binary. Many in Africa, and of course India and other parts of the world, would argue that we don't have to oscillate. We are building our own space. And in our own space, it is not having to choose sides. It is having to have the best of all sides. And you had a non-alignment of the past. Do you see that there is a third space that will emerge, or are you fatalistic and maybe European in that sense of having to choose one over another?
Well, in fact, Europe also doesn't want to get caught and doesn't want to side with the one or with the other, or let's say with the one against the other. So probably the good story out of all this disorder and chaos is that the third way would be one that goes in the direction of diversification. Diversification was mentioned many times today. So diversification of supply chains, of value chains, other stories involving as many actors as possible along the whole, production line. And that would be a story where the European powers, but also India, but also African states, and of course other Asian, rising ASEAN region, new, bloc that will see a lot of growth, can offer as an alternative to a violent decoupling. And I think that systemic coexistence, that means that both system powers realize that a violence between them, a military conflict, will be disastrous for everyone. Would probably be the, let's say, best case scenario where, in this kind of decoupling, the gray zone in between will be occupied by all these, alternative stories of success.
Very interesting. I'll come back to you later on this point, but let me now turn to Lydia. Lydia, with the proliferation of digital platforms, social media, weaponization of news, disinformation, individuals, non-state actors, bad actors have more power to destabilize societies, countries, economies than ever before. We are also seeing, and this is the global phenomenon, we are seeing an increase in polarization. And some of them are historic, which are being in many ways catalyzed to become more aggressive today. Others are artificially contrived, where there was no problem between communities, some seeds have been sown. How can we respond to this new security, in some sense, landscape, where anyone with a mobile phone has the potential to destabilize large nations?
Well, I think we first have to start with who's the we. How do we solve for this? And the we is not just the government, it's not just the companies, it's also societies and communities. And one, I think it starts with education. I think our societies need to be more educated about how algorithms work, how polarization can happen with these algorithms, so that they are better aware of when they see fake news, they can start to ask themselves, well, wait a minute, why is the algorithm giving me all of these things that look alike? Why is the algorithm giving me all these things that incite fear and hatred? So having that kind of self-awareness around that, I think, is a really important part for society to be more informed. And then I think government has a huge role to play in regulating some of these algorithms and how they work.
So let me hold you there. You said we. You conveniently removed government in your first part of response. And when it comes to action and responsibility, you quickly reintroduce government. That we does not include government. But when it comes to acting on the challenge, let's go back to the government. So let me ask you a more pointed question. I mean, I know listen, I'm in agreement with you. I'm just being a little mischievous here. Okay? So my more pointed question is, stability, rules-based order. I'm picking a leaf out of an American playbook or a European handbook. The rules-based order was all predicated on the concept of sovereignty. the United Nations system itself understood the centrality of the nation state, right? And the response to the challenge also happens to invoke the nation state. The question here is, why do we want the nation state to be the enforcer of an order while we don't want it to be the regulator of the order?
Well, enforcement comes through the government. So when we say law enforcement, that law enforcement is done by government employees who are...
And yet you want to defund the police force in America.
I don't want to defund it. There are many people who do not want to defund it. That is a different political argument for grievances represented by a few communities around that. I think the challenge is there's no simple answer here, and it's a little bit broader. But basically, governments have an important role to play with how we live our lives inside that sovereignty. And so, therefore, we need to turn to governments to ask them to regulate more appropriately within our sovereign bounds, because we continue to live by the laws inside that territory. So does that make sense so far?
No,
why we need to bring the government back in?
No, of course it does. But you know, just to extend this argument, because we are seeing this tension, countries are beginning to disconnect from each other. Like we are banning apps, we are banning access to certain content, we are canceling certain kind of content and videos and of course reels, etc. Do you think connectivity and actually the attack on connectivity, what I call the recession of globalization, is now seen as a viable political tool to respond to the challenges of fake news, polarization, influence operations, interference, whichever way. So are we going to see many states, EU has taken certain steps, Australia is thinking about certain steps, Poland has some laws, very strict laws around it now. Are you seeing a certain attack inevitable on the connectivity that brought us all together as a global community?
No, not as such. I don't think that there's an attack on all of that. I don't think we can just cancel one app. That doesn't address the problem. The problem is that we have allowed algorithms to do what they will. We've allowed biases to take over. We've allowed this polarization. So at the beginning you can say, oh, well, we weren't aware of this. We didn't know that this happens. But we are well past that point of awareness. And so now is the point where we say canceling an app or not allowing a certain website in a country does not solve for these kinds of tensions that arise. We need to face them and say we do need to have some hard conversations, and it's completely natural for nations to have disputes within them and for many societies inside one nation to have some grievances that need to be resolved. We are ignoring some of those things, and we can't entirely just blame a digital big tech company for all of that. So there's an element of that hard work.
Actually, we can blame 4 of them or 5 of them. But I think giving them a free pass perhaps might be a little convenient right now. But I'll come back to you. So, you know, I wanted to start with the challenges we are facing. Clearly, the geopolitical system that Evelina mentioned, the digital disorder that Lydia was speaking on. Let's go to the solution side of it. Let's see what are the possible pathways for all of us to perhaps embrace. And let me start with Oshrit. You know, given the recent changing dynamics in the Middle East, is this projecting a new way to approach crisis and security threats? In the Middle Eastern experience of the recent past, is that giving us a path ahead?
So I think the strict and the hyper-strategic alliance that characterized the region of the Middle East during the Cold War era are now vanishing. And it seems like a new order is emerging that is much more hybrid, unpredictable, but at the same time, you know, hybrid, unpredictable, but sometimes very much pragmatic, especially when it comes to the economic front. So sometimes doing the opposite of what the region was doing before is a new approach. And this is true as well when we're talking about the Middle East way of dealing with Israel. If we want to analyze the normalization between the Arab states and Israel. And when people are talking today about the Abraham Accords, so everybody talking about the effect of, you know, the Abraham Accords now on the region. But I think the question, and the fair question that should be asked, is how the region got changed that the Abraham Accords became possible. And that takes us to the Arab Spring in 2011, when the citizens of the countries in Libya and Egypt and Syria were protesting against the government. And then, if we take a look at what's happening in the Gulf, for example, we saw how the leaders of the Gulf countries they tried to understand how they can give more to the people in order to battle the economic challenges in the future. And then we saw this beginning of thinking how we can cooperate with Israel and what they have in stake when it comes to cooperation with Israel. So we saw the example in Saudi Arabia. For example, King Abdullah was allocating massive funds to give 3 months bonuses to the people and providing more housing project to the Saudi public. And but the most important thing that happened with the Arab Awakening is that the people actually were demonstrating, and I think it was the loss of fear of the people. And they were demanding more from the government. They were demanding more, better economic goods, better services, better governments. And this actually made the change. So when it comes to that, I think that Israel can provide, when it comes to food security, to climate change, to all of that, to cybersecurity as well, Israel can be a good solution. So then they decided to talk about engaging with Israel. Even before the Abraham Accords, we know that the UAE invited Israel to open its office in 2015. So that was like a few years before the Abraham Accords happened in August 2020. So I think what we see now is that this government, we are talking about new approaches. So sometimes doing the opposite of what you were doing along history is the new way of these countries.
And this is a lesson for other regions as well. But Velina, you know, depending on Russia for energy did not keep peace in Europe. So, you know, economic reasons might be motivating the Abraham Accords, but your gas pipelines have not necessarily resulted in peace.
Exactly. And the other thing is, once again, diversification, because first, American withdrawal from the Middle East was the major factor for regional actors to get involved with each other, to fill the vacuum, to actually, you know, deal with the chaos by the most significant external power leaving behind, right?
Yeah.
So I argue that, of course, Arab Spring was significant. New generation, new demands, you know, also going back to the digital, connecting people. People are looking how other people are getting all these services at home, and they started demanding. But the geopolitical dimension was the one that now we are in a situation where Saudi Arabia is even considering dealing with Iran and normalizing relations with Israel because of the lack of a significant geopolitical player as
an external actor.
And then again, the dragon bear is on the ground. China being the trading, you know, trade partner #1 in terms of exports of
Dragon bear is Velina's
energy.
reference to Russia and China in one word.
And Russia, of course, has a solid military presence. So what I'm trying to say is that we should also be mindful of, you know, shifting geopolitical formations, partnerships at the meta level. So we have, of course, the top level, China and United States.
But I want to
the most
actually
interesting
come back
thing is,
to,
of course, this.
I just want to add something to what you said. I think you're right, of course, there's the geopolitical fact. China is involved in Russia, involvement in the region, and the fear of these countries that United States is about to withdraw from the region. But then we started to hear from Arab leaders starting talking that Israel is here to stay. And this is why we need to cooperate with Israel. Israel is not going anywhere.
Absolutely, yes.
So this is...
No, so let me stay with the Oshret. Just one more question before I turn to Omneya and come to the real matters of human security, which is, I think, of vital importance to Africa, Asia, the Middle East. I want to come to you, but Oshret, we also have this new West Asian Quad, I2U2. It's a nice acronym, right? I2U2, V2, all twos. But how can such groupings, for example, work with regions such as Africa. You know, you have clearly the Middle East, which has deep ties with Africa. You have Israel, which has its own linkages. You have India, which has historic relationships. How can a West Asian Quad, for example, or India and Israel partnership serve the African continent?
Well, I think the word is going to multilateral, multidimensional trend, and joining the right partnership, it's true for our private life, is the most important decision we can do, but it's also true when it comes to a country and when it comes to a continent, and I think Africa should join a bigger alliance, a bigger group, and the world should provide its option. And if we think about Africa, Africa is the second largest continent, so much potential for growth and development. And if we look at India and Israel, both countries has a lot to offer to Africa. And actually in 2017, when Prime Minister Narendra Modi visited Israel, Netanyahu was saying actually that we are looking forward to the press, and that was very surprising. He was mentioning we both were looking to work together with the third countries, and he mentioned Africa, and that was very surprising at the time. Why we would work with Africa? We were just engaging, we were just promoting our relationship, and as we know, India is already working here at infrastructure project and other projects. But Israel is trying to, as well, in the last decades, to enhance its relations with Africa. In 2016, Benjamin Netanyahu was visiting here, and he was in East African countries, including Rwanda. And if we talk about how these countries can collaborate and help Africa, I think there are two models. One of them, I call it the triangular model, with India, Israel, Africa, and the I2U2 plus A, plus Africa, we can call it. And in both models, we can talk about agri-tech and defense and security. So when it comes to security, it's not a top secret that Israel defense industry is very popular in Indian market, in Indian defense market. And for many years, these countries were developing trust. They work together and they manufacture together. So, and we're also aware of the India's aspiration to become, to improve its defense capability, defense infrastructure capabilities. So I think when it comes to that, and we also know that Israel is working here in Africa selling defense systems. But working together, India and Israel can actually help offer Africa good equipment with Israeli brand, but in good prices that matching to Africa. And when it comes to agri-tech, I think that Africa is a fertile country. We have good climate. We have as well human resources, good potential. And both countries, we all know the Israeli technology, the irrigation technology, and waterways management, all can be used with Indian financing to help Africa to have better agriculture, but not mini agriculture, not family agriculture, but a bigger agriculture, but not, and also help Africa to actually replace Ukraine's role in the food chain system that we know now is problematic. But the added value that Israel and India can bring is not only to help Africa to sell its products to the world, but also be able to help Africa to build its agriculture industry, which means that processed food will be exported from Africa outside.
So and value being created in the agri sector. Interesting, but let me turn back to security and human security. And Omneya, you have been following this. So let me ask you two questions. These are the big pictures that we were discussing. But in reality, it's about human beings. How do we look at human security in a new light? Human trafficking, smuggling of immigrants. It's rampant across Asia and Africa, both continents. And it causes terrible situations. Many a times it has terrible geopolitical outcomes. How do we respond to this challenge? And your center and you have been particularly interested in some of this. So I wanted to ask you, how can we work together on this?
speaking of people caught in between.
All of this that you heard.
Yes, yes. So Africa. So there is a conversion of problems in Africa, as you rightfully mentioned, and other panelists as well. Climate, conflict, displacement, disasters, natural disasters. And the problem is not the fact that they are in this compounded nature of these problems. It's in the fact that they are protracted. They're not going anywhere. They're not expected to be temporary. And so crisis management interventions, short-term projects and interventions are not efficient, not effective. And so Africa is starting to think about the fragility problem, the resilience building in response to this, and working on that. And so the issue with fragility is that it's linked to climate change because it is a multiplier. It's an amplifier of fragility. And this link, for example, between climate change and conflict, even though it might not be established properly yet by evidence, the link with displacement, for example, is. And so in response to this, it is important to build the synergies of government and local response. But the issue is that conflict, when you speak about climate adaptation efforts, the national contributions, the NDCs, you cannot really tackle these issues, and you cannot really improve on them when you have conflict-affected settings. And climate change is detrimental for already fragile contexts as conflict-ridden countries and regions in Africa. And so it is important that, one, we build the synergies and the strategic alignment between peacebuilding and peacekeeping communities and the climate communities when we're tackling the responses, but also to improve climate finance for conflict-affected settings. Mm-hmm. And these are increasing in Africa. They are, by the day and the month. For example, the numbers show that the access of fragile or conflict-ridden countries to climate finance today is 1 to 80 mm-hmm. of the available funding for other countries that are not fragile or not conflict-ridden. So back to the response. There is this focus on fragility, tackling and resilience building, and that takes us to community-based solutions. It takes us to building institutions in Africa, and governance has been a challenge for years. Mm-hmm. And institutions, I mean, not only central within the central government, but also on the local level and the communities. So that takes us to capacity building and knowledge transfer, which takes us, I'm taking you through the challenges. It takes us to knowledge and data. So how can you build the capacity to plan interventions and responses to various threats that you mentioned and others, including, of course, climate, without having
information and knowledge and data.
And currently, as we speak, there are no data sets that look at basic issues such as, for example, environmental migration across Africa. Even though we have 32 forcibly displaced people in Africa as we speak, including almost nearly 32 million. Including nearly 8 million refugees.
So let me ask you a question, Omneya.
Yeah.
And I think this is a serious question for all of us. I think when you have millions of climate refugees, no country should believe that they are safe. I think when people move, there is friction in that very large motion that will unfold over the coming decades. So it's an interesting. In your center, it's a terrifying challenge actually. In your center, have you seen examples or institutions or cases outside where you see hope of creating frameworks to manage this?
So let me take you back just a minute to the term climate refugees. At the moment, even though there has been a fierce debate on the global level, climate refugees are not a legal term. There are displacements, but to link them again, we need scientific evidence. To link them to climate and to natural disasters that are framed as climate change hazards. But that said, yes, there is a big movement, and there are responses on the African level for this. Africa, as we speak, is formulating a common position vis-à-vis climate and security, which will include focus on, or expected to include, focus on migration. And has in the past attempted to tackle this through various policy documents. But at the end, it goes back to the issue of both central planning, which includes capacities and cooperation between African countries, but also resources. The issue of resources, of course, you know, with the effect of COVID-19 is just really slowing down the response to both the migration and including the refugee issue, but also overall development issue. And let me add that it is expected by, you know, global or international estimations that by 2050, in sub-Saharan Africa alone, it is expected to be 85 million people just forced to leave out their houses and be displaced by climate risk, which is a big number. So talking about efforts to tackle the resilience, to improve the resilience and tackle fragility in Africa is just, is not a luxury anymore. It is something that has to be tackled right now. Otherwise, the scale of the problem is sometimes beyond our ability to foresee it.
So I want to bring in questions from the audience, if there are any. I can see a hand there, and I can see Henrietta there, and Shob is just lifting both his arms, so I don't know whether he has two questions, but so let's start with you. Can you have a mic here, please?
As they find a mic, maybe I could just add that I want to just say that I also think that there's a failure of imagination here. When you talked about how the implications are far broader than we can even understand or fathom, I think we need to spend a lot more time talking about that. And we also don't really talk about systems thinking. We take climate change and we put it in a silo, and then we put another issue like agri-tech in a silo. Or digital, and we put these, like we say, oh, they're verticals or they're horizontals, but actually, if we should just throw all that away and say they're a kaleidoscope. When you look into a kaleidoscope, everything starts to merge with each other.
Go ahead, sir.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I would like to attract the panelists to talk about a little bit on governance as an aspect that would provide a solution to issues of security, but also that undermines security in some instances. And more particularly, on how we pride ourselves in innovation, but it seems like governance is the area that you have decided not to innovate, yet it is the critical aspect in societies.
Henriette.
Thanks. I'm Henriette Esterhuizen from Association for Progressive Communications. Firstly, I feel the panel, I mean, the kind of insecurity that is created by this pragmatic partnerships, I'd like you to talk about that. You know, a pragmatic partnership between India, Israel, and African countries might work to build trust between those three states. It doesn't necessarily help to build trust between African states and their citizens. Just, you know, look at the NSO group and the Pegasus project. And that kind of trust between state and citizens for us in Africa is essential if our digital transformation projects are going to work. Those kind of pragmatic partnerships also tend to not pay sufficient attention to international law, you know, particularly human rights law, which is just disregarded. That undermines the global multilateral system. It undermines international collaboration and people's trust in that international multilateral system upholding international law and agreements. So just a little bit on the other side. And then the final comment, just let's not just constantly talk about Africa's potential. We also need to look at the fragility. In terms of climate change, we have dry zones in the north and the south, which are very dramatically affected by climate change. We have conflict, the news, Sierra Leone, just in the last few days. So I just feel everyone is talking a little bit glibly about Africa's potential. We also need to confront the fragility if we're going to make change.
So, Omneya, you mentioned the word fragility a few times, but I think perhaps we can actually use this as the final intervention from all of us. And we can actually focus on two aspects, and I think both the questions are interconnected. Trust in government and governance innovation at one end of the spectrum. And of course, state agreements versus the buy-in and the benefits, or rather the implications for citizenry. So what does it really mean? Does it increase trust in governments, or actually creates a citizen versus government dichotomy within states which are already fragile and struggling with other challenges? I think that's the point these two questions pose for all of us. Maybe we can start with Omneya, and then we can go down the panel after that.
Okay, well, I think I've spoken about the risks, long enough, but I can mention a good initiative as a best practice, which is the African Mobility Initiative. And it had succeeded in creating a model where they can anticipate where the hot zones for migrations in migration in Africa can be, especially when it comes to climate risk driven migration. And this model, it's an example of a scientific approach to and foresight and early warning, and it's now being implemented across the continent. So of course the system is as good as the information you feed into it, and that takes us back to knowledge.
What about the second aspect of the question, trust between citizenry and governments?
Well, trust, it's linked to all the policies that we would like to see implemented in Africa, isn't it? Including inclusive and sustainable response to climate change and other related risks. When you want to have the buy-in of local communities, you need to have the trust, and you need to have the representation and their opinion heard. So I will stop at that quick remark.
Velina, you want to come in?
Yes, of course. It's a very interesting question, because if I look at it from the perspective of an European, of course, first we have a very complex twofold process of institutions and government. So governance in Europe is very different from what is working in other parts of the world. But the lesson there is that trust basically is being put on both levels, on the level of the own government, but also on the level of European institutions, that a lot of the legal frameworks emerged out of the last 50 years, due to this contract, and citizens have a large part to play. The example.
But let me flip the question for you. Let me make it tougher for you. Do you think that some of your agreements with governments in Africa are creating a distance between the state and their citizens? So when you decide to partner with a country here, are you thinking about what the mood in the street is, or are you using the expedient pathway of dealing with the elite? I think that's perhaps a question to ask you.
Yes, I think that it's still very much state to state, let's say institutions to state relations, which is wrong, and it needs to regard the new realities that societies in African countries are becoming more active, becoming more involved in politics and economics due to also the technological revolution. And this is, I think, probably is going to be the major threshold to be overcome in this process. I also do not agree with this common approach that all are put in the one pot. That means that if, for instance, Europe comes with a concrete proposal, let's say the infrastructure project, the infrastructure project as opposed to China's Belt and Road initiative involves 150 billion euro that are meant specifically for Africa. But if you start asking the European institutions how this money is going to be spent, in which countries, what kind of priorities, nobody can tell. So, of course, this top-down, highly institutionalized approach is often, I think, also not the best solution. We probably should think of a triad of citizens, governance, and institutions. I think that this would be the best way to approach the issue in the future.
Good. Lydia, you want to come in on this?
Yes, I agree with that triad. Something I'd like to bring from earlier this morning, a speaker reminded us, a speaker from Kenya, that the continent is made out of 54 countries that are all very different and have different political and climate realities. And so we cannot at all lump them all in the same box. Also, though, what I would say is that to that triad that you spoke to, I also think that the government has a role to play to stand up for the needs of each country as they relate to dealing with other governments and organizations. And finally, with the climate aspects that you were talking about, I couldn't agree more, and something that I think we didn't bring up is the rising coast on the west side of Africa. We've talked about droughts and all these other things, but we forget about how certain land is maybe not going to be around in that 2050 timeframe, and how do you prepare for that as well?
Final words, Oshrit.
I just want to add something regarding the Pegasus comment. I think, one company damaged the reputation of the cyber security industry in Israel so much. And if we think about it, let's take things in proportion. Of course, it's bad when it's being used against human rights and against, journalists and political rivals. But let's not forget that the Pegasus system is being used at the same way to find criminals. And that's the job of the government, to protect the citizens and find the right criminals. And that's also help to build trust. So this is another way to use the same system in a different way.
Great. So I think that brings us to the close, and I think we've had a good conversation on a vast range of issues. Food for thought for all of us to take back. This is not a security conference, but we wanted to really bring this into the fray so that we understand that everything we aspire for in terms of our development and growth ambitions is happening in a backdrop of a world that is facing other challenges as well. And this was just a teaser, and do join their Twitter timelines and their pages to read more about everything that they do. And with this, please join me in applauding this panel. And thank you very much for coming and joining us here. Shub, over to you for the next steps.
Quick housekeeping announcement. We'll have a short